Imagine two canoes frantically paddling down a freezing, unforgiving river in the Canadian North. I mean, the water is almost black. It's carrying these jagged chunks of ice. The air is so bitter it literally burns the lungs, and the paddlers are just absolutely exhausted.
Oh yeah, they'd be pushed to the absolute physical limit.
Exactly. Their muscles are screaming with every single stroke, fighting the current, fighting the onset of winter. But here's the thing, they aren't racing for gold. They aren't rushing to stake a claim on, a rich vein of minerals or to conquer land.
Right.
They are racing to claim the souls of the Indigenous families camped at the very end of the river.
It sounds almost like a scene from an adventure novel, right?
Yeah.
But the stakes were entirely spiritual, and the consequences were incredibly real.
Yeah.
Welcome to our deep dive into the historical records of Christian missionary activity in the Canadian Arctic and Subarctic. Today, we're looking at a deeply paradoxical chapter of history.
It really is.
We are unpacking this frantic race for souls between Anglican and Catholic missionaries, and we're relying on Canadian government documents, church records, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings, and crucially, the first-hand accounts of the Inuit and Dene people who actually lived through this.
I want to start by framing this for you, the listener, especially if you caught our previous historical deep dive into Alaska. Because in that region, the missionary history was, well, it was very bureaucratic.
Extremely.
The authorities essentially sat down in a boardroom, looked at a map, and drew up a formal treaty, the Comity Agreement. They carved up the territory like a pie and agreed not to step on each other's toes, basically.
Yeah, a literal gentleman's agreement over who got what region.
Right, and a major part of their strategy there was the brutal, active suppression of native languages. But the sources for the Canadian Arctic show something completely different. I mean, there was no boardroom agreement here at all.
Not at all. In the Canadian North, there was only a chaotic, desperate sprint. And, this introduces the central paradox of our deep dive today.
Because unlike in Alaska, the missionaries in Canada didn't ban the Indigenous languages.
Exactly. In fact, they actively promoted Indigenous literacy. They spent enormous amounts of energy teaching people to read and write in their own native tongues.
See, I'm having a hard time squaring this. On one hand, the Canadian government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission unequivocally labeled what happened in these northern residential hostels as cultural genocide.
Yes, they did.
But on the other hand, these exact same missionaries were aggressively promoting native literacy. How do those two things even exist in the same historical space? Doesn't promoting a language usually, protect a culture?
Well, that is the exact tension we need to unravel today. Because, as we'll see, this promotion of literacy doesn't cancel out the harm that followed. In many ways, it actually makes the ultimate devastation inflicted by the residential school system far more complicated, not less.
Wow.
To really understand how that happened, we first have to understand how the map of the Canadian North was drawn. Because it wasn't drawn by a treaty, it was drawn by the literal physical exhaustion of those men in the canoes.
So let's dive right into that race. Because you have two primary competitors fighting for dominance over this immense frozen geography. Who exactly are they?
Right, let's look at the contenders.
And what are their specific advantages? Because from what I read in the source material, this was definitely not a level playing field.
It was a fascinating mismatch of resources and tactics, really. So in one corner, you have the Church Missionary Society, or the CMS.
Okay.
These are the Anglicans. And to be specific, they were low church evangelicals.
Wait, what does low church mean in this context? Why does that specific theological detail matter?
It matters deeply for their strategy. So low church Anglicans placed, less emphasis on ornate rituals, vestments, or the absolute authority of the priesthood. Instead, they placed a massive emphasis on personal scripture reading.
Oh, I see.
Their primary theological goal was getting the Bible directly into the hands of the individual. Now, practically speaking, the Anglicans had a colossal advantage here. Logistics?
Logistics, right.
They carried the prestige of the British Empire, but more importantly, they essentially hitched rides on Hudson's Bay Company supply ships.
Which is wild to think about, because if you're a missionary in the 1800s trying to reach the Arctic, how do you even get supplies up there? I mean, you can't just paddle a birch bark canoe carrying a massive cast iron printing press.
Or crates of heavy Bibles. Exactly. That's where the corporate alliance comes in. The Hudson's Bay Company, or HBC, was the dominant economic force in the region.
They were practically a quasi-government at that point, weren't they?
They really were. And because the HBC was a British entity, and the Anglicans were the church of the British establishment, the two formed this natural, if unofficial, partnership.
That makes total sense.
The Anglicans could load their timber, their printing presses, their food staples, and their personnel right onto the HBC ships. When the HBC established a trading post, the Anglicans could practically set up their mission right next door.
So they were relying entirely on the company's established supply chains, which means they had guaranteed food, guaranteed shelter, and guaranteed transport in literally one of the harshest climates on Earth.
Yes, it was a massive safety net. And because of that incredible logistical infrastructure, the Anglicans secured a near monopoly in the Eastern Arctic. We're talking places like Baffin Island, Nunavut, and Inuvik.
Right.
They were heavy, they were well supplied, and they were entrenched. But then, in the other corner, you have their bitter rivals, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, or the OMI.
Okay, so these are the Catholics. And just looking at the geopolitical reality of the time, they must have been operating at a severe disadvantage.
Absolutely severe.
Because they're a French Roman Catholic order trying to operate in a territory that is economically controlled by Protestant British authorities, I have to imagine the Hudson's Bay Company wasn't exactly handing them free tickets on their supply ships.
Far from it. The British authorities viewed the French Catholics with deep suspicion. The Oblates were often actively blocked, or at the very least heavily discouraged, from utilizing those established HBC supply chains.
So how did they even survive, let alone compete?
To survive and compete, the Oblates had to be incredibly scrappy. They couldn't rely on heavy infrastructure. They had to be highly mobile. So they adopted indigenous modes of travel.
Like what?
Dog sleds in the winter, specialized canoes in the summer, snowshoes.
So they are essentially traveling light and fast, but how did they eat without the HBC rations?
By living exactly how the indigenous families lived. I mean, they lived in tents, they ate the same diet of caribou, seal, or fish, and they embedded themselves deeply within the nomadic camps.
Wow. Which, if you think about it, is an incredible competitive edge in its own way.
It really was.
Because if the Anglicans are physically tied to the trading posts, the Oblates can just intercept the nomadal families out on the tundra before they even reach the post.
Precisely. And this dynamic turned the Mackenzie Valley in the Western Arctic into the ultimate contested battleground. This brings us right back to our opening image. You literally had Anglican ministers and Catholic priests paddling down the exact same rivers.
Just neck and neck.
It was a war of attrition.
Huh.
A priest would push himself to the absolute brink of physical collapse, navigating these treacherous rapids, just so he could be the first person in a clerical collar to step onto the riverbank and greet a newly arrived group of Dene or Inuit families.
I try to put myself in the shoes of an Indigenous family in that moment. You know, you are living according to the seasonal cycles of the land, hunting caribou, reading the ice, living just as your ancestors have for millennia.
Yeah.
And suddenly, these exhausted, half-starved European men show up at your camp, and they are intensely focused on claiming you for their highly specific subfaction of a religion you've never even heard of.
While frantically warning you about the other European man who is paddling just 3 miles behind them.
Right. It really highlights the sheer absurdity of importing a centuries-old European religious conflict directly into the Arctic.
It's profoundly absurd.
I was trying to find a way to conceptualize the lasting damage of this for the listener. It's not just about two teams competing for a prize. It's almost like, imagine two rival tech companies racing to install completely incompatible social software into a brand new community.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Because if one side of a river gets Apple and the other gets Microsoft, they suddenly can't communicate easily. But the operating software here wasn't technology, it was people's spiritual lives.
And their social structures.
Exactly. It dictated who you traded with, who you socialized with, and ultimately who you could marry. By forcing these incompatible European divisions onto these communities, they permanently fractured the social cohesion.
That is a very structural way of looking at it, and it's highly accurate.
Yeah.
Because the residue of that frantic sprint is still completely visible on the map of the North today.
Really? Even now?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because there was no boardroom treaty dividing the land, the geographic distribution of religion up there is entirely arbitrary. It's based solely on who paddled faster in the 1800s.
That is wild.
You look at a community like Fort Good Hope, for example. The Oblates got there first, planted their flag, embedded with the people, and it became a staunchly Catholic town.
Okay.
But then you look at a place like Iqaluit, which was reached by both factions at roughly the exact same time.
Yeah.
And it was left deeply, permanently divided down the middle.
Which creates an us versus them dynamic in an environment where cooperation is literally a matter of life and death. I mean, if a winter is particularly harsh and the caribou migration shifts, you need your neighbors.
You rely on them completely.
But suddenly your neighbors belong to a rival faction.
And the mechanism they used to cement these factions wasn't just preaching. I mean, you can't just paddle up to a camp, say a prayer in English or French, and paddle away.
Right, because the nomadic families are just going to pack up and move next season.
Exactly. To win this demographic war, the missionaries needed a way for their theology to travel with the families across the tundra.
Which brings us to arguably the most fascinating linguistic phenomenon in modern history. Because to make the message stick, they needed the written word. They needed the Inuit and Dene to be able to read the Bible.
This is the battle of the scripts. As we established, the Low Church Anglicans specifically believed that salvation required personal reading of the gospel.
Right.
But you can't just hand a standard English Bible to an Inuktitut speaker. And teaching the standard Roman alphabet, the ABCs that you and I use, is incredibly slow and pedagogically difficult when the language sounds and functions entirely differently than European languages.
So they utilized a different system, syllabics. And if you, the listener, haven't seen Indigenous syllabics, I highly recommend looking it up. Visually, it is just beautiful.
It's very striking.
It doesn't use standard letters at all. It uses a system of geometric shapes: triangles, wedges, curves, angles, and circles.
To understand why it was so effective, you really have to look at the mechanics of the script. Because unlike the Roman alphabet, where one letter generally equals one sound, syllabics represents entire syllables.
Right.
And the true brilliance is in the spatial orientation. The shape of the character gives you the consonant, and the direction it points gives you the vowel.
So just as an example, if you have a triangle shape, that represents a P sound. If the triangle is pointing up, it's pronounced pi.
Exactly.
If you rotate it to point down, it's pa. Pointing to the right, it's pa. You just rotate the geometry to change the vowel sound.
It's incredibly elegant. For languages like Cree and Inuktitut, which are heavily syllable-based, this visual logic was profoundly intuitive.
It makes so much sense.
Now, the standard historical narrative, the one that has been printed in colonial textbooks for over a century, credits a Wesleyan Methodist missionary named James Evans with inventing this entire system.
Right, the solo genius myth.
According to the colonial record, Evans was stationed at Norway House in Manitoba around 1840. The story goes that he was this linguistic genius who independently codified this brilliant geometric system for the Cree language.
And from there, the official narrative says the Anglicans took Evans's brilliant invention and adapted it for other languages. Men like John Horden and Edmund Peck modified it for Inuktitut.
Yes.
And the sources say Peck pushed this system so aggressively in the Eastern Arctic, distributing texts and setting up missions like the one on Blacklead Island in 1894, that syllabics essentially became synonymous with the Anglican Church.
And because of the Anglicans' logistical access to those HBC printing presses we talked about, they just flooded the East with syllabic material. I mean, to this day, the Inuktitut Bible is still printed in syllabics.
But the Oblates in the West had a much harder time with this, didn't they? Because they were dealing with the Dene or Athabascan languages. Why didn't they just use the exact same triangles and wedges?
Because of the underlying linguistic mechanics. Athabascan languages are linguistically incredibly complex.
In what way?
Well, they feature tonal shifts, for one. That's where the pitch of your voice actually changes the meaning of a word. And they also have complex consonant clusters that a simple geometric shape system just struggles to capture accurately.
Oh, I see.
So a Catholic Oblate named Émile Petitot tried to build a vastly more complicated version of syllabics for the Dene languages. He added all sorts of diacritics and secondary marks and little dots.
But if you make a simple geometric system too complicated, it loses its primary advantage, right? It just becomes a cluttered mess.
Precisely. Petitot's system was so dense and unwieldy that it eventually just failed. The Catholics in the West largely gave up on syllabics and reverted to teaching the standard Roman alphabet.
Which creates another divide.
Exactly. So right there, the missionary rivalry and the varied linguistic mechanics create this lasting East-West divide across the North. Syllabics took hold in the East, while the Roman alphabet dominated the West.
I want to pause here for a second, because we've just outlined the official traditional history of syllabics, the brilliant European inventor James Evans creating a gift for the indigenous people.
Textbook version.
Right. But when you look at the primary sources from the Cree people themselves, that narrative completely falls apart. The official history feels like it's hiding something massive.
This is where we must center the indigenous counter-narrative, and it fundamentally changes how we view this entire history. Within Cree oral tradition, the origin of syllabics does not begin with James Evans.
Who does it begin with?
It begins with a revered Cree spiritual man named Iqaluit. He was known in English as Calling Badger, and he was from the Stanley Mission area of Saskatchewan.
What is Calling Badger's story? How does the oral tradition explain the creation of the script?
It's a profound story. According to this deeply held tradition, Calling Badger passed away, entered the spirit world, and was subsequently returned to the world of the living.
Wow.
And when he returned, he brought the knowledge of the syllabic script with him. It was understood not as a European invention, but as a direct gift from the Creator to the Cree people.
Now, traditional history books would probably dismiss that immediately as a myth or just folklore, but let's actually look at the timeline and the mechanics of how this script spread in reality.
Let's do it.
The historical record shows that these indigenous communities became broadly literate in syllabics within a single generation. One generation.
It was unprecedented.
They were teaching it to each other in hunting camps, they were passing it along trade routes, carving it into birch bark with burnt sticks, and they were doing all of this completely outside of the missionary school system.
You've hit on the central anomaly that linguists have struggled with for decades. Introducing a completely alien writing system usually takes generations of formal institutional schooling to actually take root. The sheer speed of adoption here suggests a profound, pre-existing conceptual alignment.
Right. It implies they already possess the framework for this. Whether a listener views the story of Calling Badger as a literal historical event or as a really powerful metaphor for parallel Indigenous innovation, it shatters the colonial narrative.
It absolutely does.
The Indigenous people weren't passive, empty vessels waiting for a European savior to invent writing for them. And there's actually a piece of evidence in the colonial record itself that supports this, isn't there?
There is, and it's quite revealing. When you dig into the archives, even a 19th century report from the British and Foreign Bible Society conceded a crucial detail. It noted that James Evans took, and this is a direct quote, the idea from an Indian chief.
That is a massive admission buried in the paperwork. I mean, it shifts the entire power dynamic. It transforms syllabics from a tool of colonial imposition into a tool of Indigenous agency.
It does.
It was a collaboration or perhaps an Indigenous innovation that the missionaries merely standardized for their massive printing presses.
And understanding that agency is crucial, because the tragedy of this history is that this incredible explosion of Indigenous literacy eventually became a threat.
A threat to the authorities, you mean?
Yes. A highly literate, highly mobile, nomadic population spread across millions of square miles of tundra is incredibly difficult for a government to control and incredibly difficult for a church to permanently convert.
Which brings us to the dark turn in our deep dive. The missionaries realized that spreading the written word wasn't enough. They needed physical control of the people.
We are entering the era of centralization. Now, if you are familiar with the residential school system in the southern Canadian prairies, those were largely farming and boarding institutions.
Right, where they made the kids work the field.
Exactly. The government wanted to turn Indigenous children into agricultural laborers. But in the Arctic, farming is impossible. The permafrost prevents it. So the strategy in the north was entirely different. The core objective was centralization.
But how exactly do you force a nomadic population to centralize? I mean, these are people who move with the caribou herds and the sea ice. You can't just ask them nicely to move into a town.
No, it requires systematic coercion. The government, working hand in glove with the churches, implemented policies designed to pull families off the land entirely.
What kind of policies?
Well, they mandated that children must attend centralized day schools. If families didn't comply, they risked losing access to family allowance rations. And those rations had become increasingly necessary as the fur trade economy fluctuated.
So they starved them out, essentially.
That was part of it. Eventually, the government also began slaughtering the sled dogs under the guise of disease control or public safety, which physically stranded the Inuit and Dene. They couldn't travel anymore.
Oh, my God.
Once the families were forced into these permanent towns, the children were placed into federal hostels run by the competing churches.
The logistics of this are just staggering. Let's look at the town of Inuvik in the 1950s and 60s as a case study for this.
A perfect example.
The government decides to build massive infrastructure to centralize education for the entire Western Arctic. They fly children in from all these remote, isolated camps, and they build 2 massive hostels right there in the town.
Right. Stringer Hall, run by the Anglicans, and Grollier Hall, run by the Catholics.
This is where that exhaustion-driven canoe race we talked about at the beginning maps directly onto the bodies of these children.
It really does.
Picture a bush plane landing in Inuvik. It's filled with terrified, disoriented Indigenous kids who have just been taken from their families. As they step off the plane, they are literally sorted into these two separate buildings based solely on the religious tag their parents had been assigned decades earlier.
Assigned by whichever missionary had reached their ancestral camp first.
Exactly. It's chilling. You had siblings from mixed denomination marriages, cousins, and lifelong neighbors physically separated. And the dividing line was absolute.
Totally impermeable.
They lived strictly within their denomination's hall. They ate there, they prayed there, they slept there. The architecture of the town itself was a physical manifestation of a foreign theological turf war.
But the segregation was only the architectural layer of the trauma. The historical record demands that we look at what happened inside those walls.
We have to.
The documentation is stark, particularly when we examine institutions like the Catholic residence in Chesterfield Inlet, located in what is now Nunavut.
Yes, I read about this in the sources.
It was run by the Oblates and the Grey Nuns. It opened as St. Mary's in 1954, was later renamed Turquetil Hall, and it operated until 1969.
This is a deeply painful part of the sources, but it is essential to the truth. In 1995, the Northwest Territories commissioned an independent report to investigate the allegations coming out of Turquetil Hall.
That's right.
Investigators looked at the ledgers, they interviewed the survivors, and the conclusion was horrific. They found that of the roughly 324 children who passed through that specific hostel, many had suffered widespread systemic physical and sexual abuse.
The scale of the abuse was catastrophic, and when Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, released its final findings in 2015, they examined this entire national system.
And what was their conclusion?
They unequivocally concluded it amounted to cultural genocide. However, the TRC also highlighted a harm that was fiercely specific to the North, and that was the deliberate severance of the child's connection to the land.
I really want the listener to understand the mechanics of this, because we aren't just talking about, missing out on summer camping trips.
No, not at all.
Survival in the Arctic isn't a hobby. It is an applied science. When you take a child from the tundra for 10 months of the year and lock them inside a cinder block hostel, you are stealing the critical developmental window where they are supposed to learn how to survive.
Exactly. Arctic survival requires a highly specialized, intensely complex body of generational knowledge. I mean, you have to know how to navigate by the stars and the subtle shapes of snowdrifts.
Sure.
You have to know the migratory patterns of the animals. You have to learn the incredibly complex process of scraping, tanning, and sewing caribou skins, so the seams are genuinely waterproof.
Because if they aren't, you freeze to death.
Precisely. And you cannot learn that from a chalkboard in a sterile room while being forced to memorize European history.
So what happens to those kids when they finally age out of the hostel or try to go back home in the summer? If you deliberately remove a child's ability to survive in their own native environment, you aren't just erasing a culture, you are engineering dependency.
That is the exact mechanism of the cultural genocide the TRC described. The children returned to their camps, but they were alienated from their own environment.
They couldn't live on the land anymore. If they went out on a hunt, they were a liability. They couldn't read the dangerous sea ice. They couldn't sew the clothes needed to survive.
So they were trapped.
By default, they were forced to move back into those permanent government settlements. They had to rely on government rations, living in a wage economy that the schools hadn't actually prepared them for either. You are systematically disabling an entire population's ability to be self-sufficient.
And that dependency was not an accident. It was the inevitable structural byproduct of the centralization policy. The TRC linked the contemporary socioeconomic struggles in many northern communities, the housing crises, the poverty, the loss of identity, directly back to this calculated disruption of on-the-land learning.
When you sever the land, you sever the independence.
Exactly.
Which makes the transition to our next point so crucial. This trauma isn't relegated to history books. It's not a dusty conflict from the 1800s. It is a present-day reality for the survivors who are still living and for their children.
Very much so.
And the journey toward accountability has been deeply frustrating. The sources show a massive gap between institutional apologies and actual criminal justice.
We have to examine this tension carefully, because on July 29th, 2022, a highly significant event occurred. Pope Francis traveled to Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut.
I remember seeing that on the news.
He stood before an audience of Inuit survivors, and he delivered a direct apology, saying, "I'm sorry," in Inuktitut. He asked for forgiveness for the, and I quote, evil perpetrated by not a few Catholics. And during his flight back to Rome, he explicitly acknowledged that the residential school system amounted to genocide.
For many survivors, hearing the head of the Catholic Church stand in their territory, speaking their language, and admitting to the evil that occurred, that was a profoundly emotional milestone. Words do matter.
They do.
But the sources, particularly the voices of the Inuit organizations, ask us to look at the severe limits of an apology when it isn't backed by the machinery of the legal system. And the starkest example of this is the unresolved case of Johannes Rivoire.
The case of Johannes Rivoire is central to understanding the current state of this reckoning, and it requires us to look impartially at the legal facts as they unfolded.
Right. Let's lay out the facts.
Johannes Rivoire was an Oblate priest who was stationed in the north. It was associated with Turquetil Hall in Chesterfield Inlet. That's the very hostel where the 1995 report documented widespread abuse. Rivoire was accused by multiple Inuit individuals of sexually abusing children during his time there.
These are life-altering, severe criminal accusations.
Absolutely. However, before Rivoire could face trial in Canada, he left the country. He flew to France in 1993. Warrants were subsequently issued for his arrest in Canada, but returning him to face those charges proved to be an insurmountable legal roadblock.
Because of international law.
Well, Inuit organizations, alongside the Canadian government, pushed heavily for his extradition. But in October 2022, notably, just months after the Pope's apology in Canada, the government of France officially refused the extradition request.
What was the legal mechanism they used to deny it? I mean, how did they justify keeping him?
France cited two primary legal barriers. First, a long-standing domestic policy that bars the extradition of its own citizens. Rivoire held French citizenship.
Okay, and the second?
Second, they pointed to statute of limitations issues under French law regarding the time frame when the alleged crimes occurred. The result of these legal mechanisms was that the extradition failed. Rivoire remained free in France, and in April 2024, Johannes Rivoire died in France at the age of 93.
Having never faced a trial.
Having never faced a trial. And for the integrity of the historical record, it must be stated that Rivoire consistently denied all the allegations against him. Because he was never extradited, he was never tried, and none of the allegations were ever proven in a court of law before his death.
And what happened to the charges in Canada?
In Canada, some of the charges against him had been stayed in 2017 because prosecutors deemed a conviction unlikely without his physical presence, though at least one charge was still actively pending when he passed away.
If I can offer an analogy for you, the listener, the way this legal mechanism functioned feels like a corporate jurisdictional shield.
How do you mean?
Imagine a massive multinational corporation has a subsidiary that illegally dumps toxic waste in your town, poisoning the community. The CEO of the parent company flies to your town, looks you in the eye, and apologizes.
Right.
But when the local authorities try to arrest the subsidiary manager responsible, the parent company points out that the manager moved to a country that won't extradite him. The corporation expresses sorrow, but utilizes international borders to shield the accused from the actual mechanisms of justice.
That's a stark comparison.
But how much is the apology worth if the institution won't dismantle the shield protecting the accused?
That analogy captures the profound frustration of the survivors perfectly. It asks what reconciliation actually requires. Can reconciliation exist purely in the rhetorical space of an apology, or does it demand material legal accountability? For the survivors of Chesterfield Inlet, the death of Rivoire meant that a definitive legal accounting for his specific actions would never happen. And that lack of closure is compounded by another massive, ongoing issue highlighted in our sources: the unreleased records.
This is a huge point. It's not just about one priest evading trial. Survivors and organizations like Inuit Kanatami have been demanding the release of a massive body of relevant church and government records that remains hidden.
We are talking about millions of documents.
Millions, detailing the administration of these hostels, the movement of personnel, internal disciplinary reports, medical logs. They are still locked away in private archives.
And the withholding of these records means the full accounting of history is essentially being held hostage. You cannot have truth and reconciliation without the foundational truth.
Right. You can't reconcile what you haven't fully acknowledged.
As long as those archives remain sealed, or are only slowly trickled out after immense public pressure, the institutional shield remains intact. It continuously places the burden of proof on the fragile memories of aging survivors, rather than on the written contemporaneous ledgers of the institutions that designed and ran the system.
But despite these profound institutional failures, despite the evasion of justice and the hiding of the archives, the narrative of the Canadian Arctic is absolutely not just a story of victimization.
Not at all.
When you read the first-hand accounts of the Inuit and Dene people, the overarching theme is breathtaking resilience. It is a story of profound agency. They took the very tools meant to assimilate them and weaponize them for their own cultural survival.
To really illustrate this resilience, we must center a powerful figure in the historical record, Piita Irniq.
Yes, his story is incredible.
His life trajectory perfectly encapsulates this complex history of trauma and reclamation. Piita Irniq is an Inuk man who, as an 11-year-old boy, was taken to Turquetil Hall in Chesterfield Inlet.
The same hostel we were just discussing.
Exactly. He survived the documented abuse there. The entire design of that hostel was meant to erase his Inuk identity, to make him ashamed of his language, and to break his connection to his culture.
But the system completely failed to break him. Instead, Piita Irniq went on to become an absolute force of nature. He became a leading advocate for the revitalization of the exact cultural practices the hostel tried to eradicate.
He championed the Inuit language, he pushed for the return of traditional drum dancing, and he fought for the restoration of on-the-land knowledge.
And incredibly, he eventually became the Commissioner of Nunavut, representing his people on a national level.
His ascent represents a profound reclamation of institutional power. And understanding his background makes a specific moment during the 2022 papal visit to Iqaluit so incredibly resonant.
Set the scene for us.
When Pope Francis arrived to deliver his apology, Piita Irniq was one of the figures standing before him. And Irniq didn't just passively listen to the apology. He presented his traditional Inuit drum to the Pope.
That image is stunning. Just think about the mechanics of that encounter. An 11-year-old boy who was abused in a Catholic hostel, now standing as a revered elder and a statesman, holding his cultural artifact directly up to the head of the institution that tried to destroy it.
If we analyze the symbolism there,
Yeah.
it's a masterclass in setting the terms of engagement. The drum was an object heavily suppressed by early missionaries who viewed it as a tool of, well, pagan spirituality.
Right.
By bringing it to the Pope, Irniq is demonstrating that his culture is not a relic of the past. It is alive, it is vibrant, and it has outlasted the assimilationist policies of the Church. He is not a victim receiving an apology. He is a sovereign individual demanding recognition.
And that advocacy isn't just symbolic. Organizations like Inuit Tapiriq Kanatami, representing Inuit across the country, continue to relentlessly press both the Canadian government and the Catholic entities like the Oblates.
They are the ones fighting in the courts and the public square for structural justice.
They are the ones demanding the release of the hidden records, forcing the country to look at its own reflection.
And if we bring this narrative full circle, we really have to look at what happened to that writing system we discussed in the beginning. The syllabic script.
Right, the triangles and wedges.
Remember the context. This was a system heavily pushed by the Anglican and Catholic missionaries. Their stated goal, driven by their logistical race down the rivers, was to translate the Bible so that Indigenous people could read Scripture, abandon their traditional beliefs, and be converted.
But look at the mechanics of what actually happened. Today, that script has been entirely reclaimed. It is an Inuit and Cree-owned literacy.
It's everywhere.
If you go to Nunavut today, you will see syllabics on the stop signs. You will see it embedded in the territorial school curriculum. You will see in newspapers, literature, and official government documents published in the very wedges, triangles, and circles that the missionaries introduced.
It has become the defining feature of language revitalization efforts across the eastern and central Arctic. The script evolved from a vector of religious conversion into the primary vessel for preserving Indigenous language against the overwhelming tide of English in the modern digital world.
It's the ultimate act of historical subversion. I really want you to sit with the profound irony of this. The exact script the missionaries used to try and rewrite the minds of Indigenous people is now the primary armor those communities are using to keep Inuktitut and Cree alive.
It's a beautiful twist of fate.
The missionaries thought they were handing over a tool for assimilation, but the Indigenous people took that tool, claimed it as their own, perhaps even originated it themselves, as Calling Badger's story suggests, and they are using it right now to rebuild everything the residential hostels tried to destroy.
It perfectly encapsulates the complexity of this entire deep dive. The history of the Canadian Arctic cannot be reduced to a simple flat binary of European saviors and Indigenous victims. It is a landscape defined by chaotic collision, profound and systemic harm, incredible adaptation, and breathtaking resilience.
Let's bring it all together for you, the listener. We've covered immense ground today. We started by tracing that frantic, treatyless race for souls, watching Anglican ministers with their Hudson's Bay Company logistics compete against scrappy Catholic Oblates, permanently carving up the social map of the North.
We examined the linguistic battleground of syllabics, exploring the complex phonetic mechanics and the powerful Cree oral traditions that challenged the European narrative of invention.
We walked through the dark reality of centralization, seeing how towns like Inuvik were physically split in two, and how the residential hostels deliberately engineered dependency by severing the vital Indigenous connection to the land.
And finally, we faced the deeply painful gap between historic papal apologies and the agonizing lack of legal accountability for accused abusers like Johannes Rivoire, while honoring the unstoppable advocacy of survivors like Piita Irniq.
But as we close this deep dive, there is a final lingering question we want to leave you with, something to mull over long after this audio stops.
We established that millions of pages of documents regarding the administration of these northern hostels, the daily logs, the internal correspondence, the disciplinary records, are still being withheld in private archives.
Millions of pages.
As the older generations of survivors pass away, and as Indigenous languages fight to survive in an increasingly interconnected world, what secrets are still locked inside those unreleased boxes?
That's the question.
If the syllabic script itself could be so radically reclaimed, transformed from a colonial tool into a weapon of absolute cultural survival, what will happen when the Inuit and Dene finally gain total, unmitigated ownership of their own historical records? What new chapters of this history are sitting in the dark right now, just waiting to be uncovered by you, the listener?
So the next time you think about the history of the North, remember those two canoes exhausted on the freezing river. Remember that the race didn't end when they reached the shore. The race is still happening right now. Only today, it's a race for truth.